Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. In the context of the current Victorian Indigenous treaty-making process, a few viewers have raised queries about the first attempt at a treaty negotiated in Victoria by John Batman back in 1803. Now, for those of you watching from overseas, no, I'm not referring to the Caped Crusader. Although as a child, when my family visited Melbourne and stayed in the Batman Hotel, I was always on the lookout for the dynamic duo climbing up the wall of the building and the bat signal in the sky. I was disappointed. So if you're here for the other Batman, perhaps surprise yourself instead by continuing to watch and learning a little bit about Australian history. This video discusses Batman's negotiation of a treaty for the settlement of Melbourne and its later rejection by the British authorities. But before I get to that, I just want to note two things. First, one of the difficulties with discussing such subjects is that words like treaty and sovereignty have a range of different meanings, and people are often at cross purposes, sometimes deliberately so, when the words are used in different contexts. Treaties that deal with international relations are quite different from treaties negotiated by a government of a state with the Indigenous people who live within that state. The second point is that my area of expertise is constitutional law, and this video actually falls quite at the fringes of that. It is relevant to Australia's constitutional history, but I don't claim to be an expert on this particular historical period, so I'm really relying on secondary sources written by others. In doing so, I am, however, also drawing on some material that I previously prepared for school students, so you might see it somewhere else on the internet. What happened in relation to Batman's treaty is contested, and while I'll try to explain the different views, people will no doubt have views of their own, which is fine. I'm not the arbiter here of what is right. So, here goes. British colonists and convicts settled in Sydney, in New South Wales in 1788. At that stage, the colony of New South Wales, as claimed by the British, covered an area from the top of Queensland to the bottom of Tasmania, which was then known as Van Diemen's Land. It also extended west across about half of the continent. There were concerns that the French would try to establish competing settlements in Australia. They had already engaged in exploration around Van Diemen's Land starting in 1772 when French ships anchored at Marion Bay and engaged in the first armed conflict with Aboriginal people. In 1803, the concerns that the French might occupy Van Diemen's Land became acute. Britain was at war with France. Bass Strait was a vital shipping lane for the colony. The New South Wales governor at first sent an expedition to Van Diemen's Land to create the appearance that it had been settled by ploughing some land to make it look like they were farming it. Later that year, a real settlement was established. But as that settlement developed, it became apparent that there was a lack of suitable land in Van Diemen's Land to undertake extensive grazing. So John Batman and some other British settlers decided to create a new settlement across Bass Strait on the mainland in what was then known as the Port Phillip district of New South Wales. We now know this as the city of Melbourne in the state of Victoria. Now, who was this Batman? He was the son of a convict transported to New South Wales for theft in 1797. Batman was born and raised in Parramatta, Sydney, but he moved to Van Diemen's Land in 1821. He settled there, married a convict, and became involved in farming and grazing. He came to local fame for capturing a notorious bushranger, Matthew Brady, back in 1826. Views on Batman's character and his relationship with Aboriginal Australians have been, let's say, mixed. The official version of Batman in the Australian Dictionary of Biography refers to him as being one of the few who sought to influence Aboriginal people by kindness and who was involved in conciliation with Aboriginal peoples. But more recent accounts show him as a brutal murderer of Aboriginal people who participated in the Black Line, which sought to drive Aboriginal peoples off their land into a limited area of Tasmania or onto islands offshore. His neighbour, the artist John Glover, described Batman as a rogue, thief, cheat and liar, a murderer of blacks and the vilest man I have ever known. Not the sort of thing that you would want put on your tombstone, is it? Batman and some of the other graziers in Van Diemen's Land formed the Port Phillip Association to lobby the New South Wales government for the allocation of land in the Port Phillip district. When the government did not react quickly enough, Batman went off to negotiate access to the land with the local Aboriginal peoples. Given his previous violence towards Aboriginal people in Tasmania, it's quite interesting that he took such a different approach. On the 6th of June 1835, by what was described as a beautiful stream of water, Batman met with elders of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin nation and entered into 2 treaties. The location is believed to be the Merry Creek in Northcote in Melbourne, although no one's actually quite certain. During a recent trip to Melbourne, I actually went for a walk along the Merry Creek, so I could better imagine the scene where all of this took place. And these are my photos of that rather chilly walk that day. One of these purported treaties was for 500,000 acres of land around Port Phillip Bay. That original document is held by the State Library of Victoria. The other purported treaty was for about 100,000 acres in the area that is now Geelong in Victoria. The treaties had been prepared in advance on parchment by a Hobart town lawyer, Joseph Gellibrand. In exchange for the land, Batman provided blankets, knives, looking glasses, tomahawks, beads, scissors and flour as payment, with an agreement to pay a yearly rent. This suggests that the agreement was not one for the permanent transfer of the land, but a right to occupy the land that was conditional upon the annual payment of rent. The transaction was accompanied by the ceremonial handing over of soil by each of the 8 elders. Batman wrote in his diary, "The parchment the 8 chiefs signed this afternoon, delivering to me some of the soil, each of them as giving me full possession of the tracts of land." When Batman returned to Van Diemen's Land with his parchment, he attempted to get it formally recognised by the governor. In a letter to the Lieutenant Governor of Tasmania, Sir George Arthur, Batman referred to the Aboriginal peoples as, quote, "the real owners of the soil," unquote, which is again an interesting assertion for the time. But Batman's efforts did not wash with the government. The Governor of New South Wales, Sir Richard Burke, issued a proclamation on the 26th of August 1836 declaring that every such treaty, bargain and contract with the Aboriginal natives for the possession, title or claim to any lands lying within that area claimed by the British is void and of no effect against the rights of the Crown. He added that all persons taking possession of such lands without the authority of the government will be considered trespassers. Now, for those of you who've watched my previous video about when New Zealand was part of New South Wales, the same thing actually happened there around this period. There had been real problems in New Zealand with what was known as land sharking, where colonists would buy vast tracts of land from the local Maori people for goods, and in that case also weapons. This was later banned by the British so that no title could be granted to the land except from the Crown. Back in Australia, the British had claimed the whole of the Port Phillip district when they settled New South Wales in 1788. They considered that this meant that the British Crown held the underlying ownership rights, which was known as the radical title to the land, so that only it could grant the land to others. Instead, the New South Wales Governor allowed members of the Port Phillip Association to buy the relevant land from the Crown, while deducting from the price the costs that the association had already laid out on exploration and the transport costs of the settlement. At that time, there was no consideration that the common law recognised the native title rights of local Aboriginal people. That would not come until the Mabo decision in 1992 by the High Court of Australia. That decision, however, did still accept the ongoing radical title held by the Crown and the ability to make grants of land that are inconsistent with common law native title rights. Now, what happened from the point of view of the Aboriginal peoples involved in the making of these purported treaties? The Wurundjeri leaders of the time were in contact through trade routes with Aboriginal peoples further north who had already lost much of their lands to British settlers. So they were most likely aware of what was likely to happen to them. There are different views about what occurred and whether the treaty was even genuinely signed. One view is that there was a complete misunderstanding between both sides as to the agreement that was made. It's been argued that the notion of the sale of land was not something within the conception of the Wurundjeri, who considered that the people belonged to the land and could not part with it. The passing of the handful of soil most likely meant different things to the two sides. In England, it was symbolic of the passing of ownership of land, whereas to the Wurundjeri, it most likely indicated agreement to safe passage across the land as long as good relations were maintained. Another view is that the Wurundjeri leaders were more sophisticated, pragmatic and informed than they're often given credit for being. They were prepared to permit the colonisers to live with them on their lands in exchange for a yearly rent comprised of objects that were useful to them. They saw this as a better compromise than being dispossessed, as had occurred to the north. When the rent stopped being paid after a couple of years, their leaders objected strongly. Batman, of course, had no authority to make any kind of treaty, and it was never recognised as a treaty by the governing authorities. At most, it's an interesting historical artefact. It may just have been a way for Batman to benefit himself by claiming a large area of land without having to pay the British government for it, or it might have shown genuine recognition by Batman that the Aboriginal people were the true owners of the land. Or perhaps it was both. We'll probably never know. Thank you once again for watching the Constitutional Clarion. If you're in Melbourne, I do encourage you to take a walk along the banks of the Yarra River and the Merry Creek. It does remain a very beautiful area to explore. And, as always, I look forward to seeing you again next time. Goodbye.